The stationary life of the traveling elite. Hey guys, welcome. We're going to imagine ourselves tucked away in the corner of a quiet, rain-slicked train station dining on one of those grand, drafty Victorian cathedrals of iron and glass, where the only thing moving is the clock. While the rain taps out a rhythm on the roof, we're going to drift through the lives of the people who used to inhabit these first-class carriages. People who had all the money in the world, the finest silk waistcoats, and, unfortunately, some of the most specialized DNA on the planet. So, settle in. Let's talk about the royals who were far too tired, too eccentric, or just too biologically confused to actually run a country. We start our journey with a man who was, quite literally, designed to be a disaster. Let's talk about Charles II of Spain. Now, if you've ever seen a portrait of Charles, you know the vibe. He's the ultimate half-baked Habsburg potato. By the time Charles staggered onto the throne in 1665, the Habsburg family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a very lonely, very tangled thicket. His ancestors had been marrying their cousins and nieces for so long that the gene pool had the consistency of a puddle in a drought. Poor Charles was the climax of this experiment. He didn't just have the famous Habsburg jaw. He had a jaw so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth couldn't actually meet. This meant he couldn't chew his food properly, because why bother with digestion when you're the King of Spain? He basically spent his life swallowing his meals whole, which, as you can imagine, didn't do much for his social life or his stomach. He was also reportedly unable to speak clearly until he was nearly 4, and he didn't walk until he was 8. But, you know, he was the king, so everyone just kind of leaned in and nodded whenever he made a noise. The court of Spain at this time was a place of stifling, soul-crushing etiquette. It was a world where a queen could fall off her horse and almost die, because no man was allowed to touch her foot to help her up. In this rigid, weird environment, Charles was a ghost. He was often described as being short, lame, and somewhat melancholic, which is a very polite 17th century way of saying the guy was a walking medical miracle. His head was said to be too large for his body, and his mind, well, his mind was mostly occupied with the fear that he had been hexed. He was known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because, naturally, when your family spends 200 years marrying their own relatives and you end up sickly, it couldn't possibly be biology. It must be a secret curse from a disgruntled sorcerer. Charles spent a significant portion of his reign undergoing exorcisms. Imagine the scene: a quiet, dimly lit palace room, the smell of incense, and a group of priests yelling at a very tired man who just wanted to take a nap and maybe eat some soup he didn't have to bolt like a snake. Despite being essentially a biological dead end, the entire world was obsessed with his love life. The fate of Europe rested on whether or not Charles could produce an heir. He was married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans. She was a vibrant, beautiful French princess who was understandably horrified when she met her new husband. She reportedly cried for days. Charles, for his part, was quite fond of her in his own quiet, stunted way. He used to follow her around like a sad royal shadow. But when she died without children, the pressure doubled. He then married Maria Anna of Neuburg. Maria Anna was a lot. She was ambitious, she was loud, and she quickly realized that her husband was more of a decorative object than a ruler. She spent most of her time arguing with his mother, Mariana of Austria, who, by the way, was also Charles's niece or his mother. It's hard to keep track when the family tree looks like a pretzel. The two women fought over everything, while Charles sat in the corner, probably thinking about how nice it would be to be a peasant who could at least bite into an apple. As the rain falls on our imaginary station, we see Charles fading. He died at 38, looking like a man of 80. The autopsy, because 17th century doctors were nothing if not thorough and slightly morbid, claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn and his head was full of water. It was a quiet, sad end to a dynasty that had quite literally eaten itself. But let's float away from the gloomy Escorial and move toward the chilly, damp corridors of the Russian Empire. If the Habsburgs were a study in stagnation, the Romanovs were a study in how many bad decisions can we make in 1 week. Take Peter III of Russia. Peter is one of those figures who felt like he was accidentally dropped into the wrong century. He was a German prince who suddenly found himself the heir to the Russian throne, a country he didn't like, with a language he didn't care to speak, and a wife, Catherine the Great, who was significantly smarter than him. Peter was a man of simple tastes, and by simple, I mean he was obsessed with toy soldiers. Even after he was married, he would spend hours in his bedroom arranging thousands of little lead soldiers in complex battle formations. There is a famous, possibly slightly exaggerated story that Catherine once walked into his room to find a rat hanging from a tiny, makeshift gallows. When she asked what on earth was going on, Peter explained completely seriously that the rat had committed a military offense by eating the head off one of his toy soldiers, and therefore it had to be court-martialed and executed. You have to appreciate the commitment to the bit. Peter's reign lasted about 6 months. He spent most of that time irritating the Russian military by forcing them to wear tight, uncomfortable Prussian-style uniforms because he thought they looked snappy. He also had a habit of making everyone stay up all night for grueling, boring dinner parties, where he would talk about how much he loved Frederick the Great of Prussia. Eventually, Catherine, who had spent her time reading Enlightenment philosophy and making friends with the guards, decided she'd had enough of the toy soldiers and the rats. One day, while Peter was off at one of his country estates, Catherine put on a uniform, hopped on a horse, and declared herself empress. Peter's reaction was essentially, "Oh, okay then." He abdicated, asked if he could keep his favorite violin and his personal doctor, and was promptly sent away to a comfortable house in the country, where he died a few days later under mysterious circumstances involving a bar fight or possibly a very aggressive piece of wallpaper. It's a gentle reminder that in the world of royals, being mildly eccentric is fine, but being boring and annoying is a capital offense. The gilded nursery of the Swan King. So, let's leave the damp palaces of Russia behind for a moment. Imagine the rain is now pattering against the heavy leaded glass of Versailles. It's a rhythmic, comforting sound, the kind that makes you want to pull the velvet curtains shut and just exist. But inside those walls, life was anything but restful. If you were a child born into the French royal family, the Bourbons, you weren't exactly a kid. You were more of a high-stakes investment with a very fragile constitution. Let's float over to the nursery of Louis XIV, the Swan King. Now, Louis XIV had a lot of everything: palaces, wigs, wars, and naturally, he had a lot of children. But being a Bourbon child in the 17th and 18th centuries was a bit like being a very expensive piece of porcelain in a house full of clumsy ghosts. Take the Grand Dauphin, Louis's eldest son. He was born to be the next Swan King, but he spent his entire life being eclipsed by his father's literal and metaphorical radiance. The Grand Dauphin was, by all accounts, a remarkably average man in a family that demanded spectacular behavior. He was quiet, he was stout, and he had a passion for, wait for it, wolf hunting. Because why not? If your dad is busy building the Hall of Mirrors, you might as well go into the woods and look for canines. The Grand Dauphin's life was a long, slow wait in a very gold-plated lobby. He was the heir apparent for 50 years. 50 years of being told how important he was while having absolutely nothing to do. He grew up in a world where doctors believed that fresh air was a dangerous radical idea, and that the best way to treat a fever was to bleed the patient until they were essentially a human raisin. As a child, the Dauphin was subjected to a grueling education. His tutors were determined to turn him into a philosopher king, but the poor boy mostly just wanted to eat. He was famously fond of heavy, cream-laden French cuisine, which, to be fair, who isn't? But when you combine a sedentary lifestyle with the Bourbon habit of marrying your cousins, you end up with a prince who is perpetually tired. He spent most of his adult life in a sort of polite, royal daze, nodding along to his father's grand speeches while probably thinking about his next bowl of stew. He eventually died of smallpox at the age of 49, never having worn the crown. His father, the Swan King, outlived him. In fact, the Swan King outlived almost everyone. He outlived his son, his grandson, and most of his great-grandsons. This brings us to one of the most stressful periods in the history of the French nursery. Around 1712, a literal wave of illness, likely measles or smallpox, ripped through Versailles. In the span of a few weeks, the royal line was decimated. The Grand Dauphin's son died. Then his wife died. Then their eldest son died. The only person left standing between the Bourbon dynasty and total extinction was a 2-year-old boy, the future Louis XV. Now imagine being a 2-year-old in a palace where everyone you know has just vanished. The court was in a state of absolute panic. The doctors, in their infinite, terrifying wisdom, wanted to bleed the toddler to purify his blood. This was the standard medical procedure, and if a child looks sick, take away the one thing keeping them alive. However, Louis XV had a guardian angel, his governess, the Madame de Ventadour. She was a woman of remarkable common sense for the 18th century. When the doctors arrived with their lancets and their leeches, she basically performed a one-woman heist. She locked herself in the nursery with the 2-year-old prince, refused to let the doctors in, and most radically, fed him soup and let him sleep. She literally saved the French monarchy by practicing basic babysitting. Because of her, Louis XV lived to become Louis the Beloved, though he eventually became Louis the well-not-so-beloved anymore once he started losing wards and spending all the country's money on mistress-decorated apartments. But as a child, he was a fragile, pale little thing who lived in a world of shadows. He was constantly surrounded by people who were terrified he would sneeze and accidentally end the dynasty. He grew up with a strange, melancholic attachment to death. As an adult, he was obsessed with funerals and would often ask his courtiers about the gruesome details of their relatives' passings. It's what happens when your entire childhood is a graveyard of what-ifs. Let's drift a little further down the timeline, past the heavy perfumes of Louis XV's court, to the most tragic nursery of all, rather that of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. We all know the end of that story. The guillotine, the revolution, the whole let-them-eat-cake thing, which she never actually said, by the way. But why let facts ruin a good riot? But the life of their son, Louis Charles, the lost Dauphin, is the ultimate sleepy-time tragedy. He was a bright, bubbly little boy who loved gardening. He had his own little plot of land at Versailles, where he grew flowers for his mother. But when the revolution hit, he went from a palace to a damp, dark prison cell in the Temple Tower. He was separated from his family and kept in solitary confinement. The Revolutionary Guards, who weren't exactly known for their empathy, tried to re-educate him by teaching him to curse and drink. It's a stark, gray contrast to the gold leaf of his ancestors. He died at the age of 10, likely from tuberculosis exacerbated by neglect. For years afterward, rumors swirled that he had escaped, that a lost prince was out there somewhere, living a quiet life as a clockmaker or a farmer. It's a nice thought to drift off to, the idea that a boy who lived through a nightmare finally found a quiet place to sit by a fire and listen to the rain, far away from the burden of a crown. The tea and tinctures of Cusot, let's leave the damp, revolutionary cobblestones of Paris behind. We're crossing the Channel now. Imagine the rain has turned into a thick, gray British mist, the kind that clings to the windows of a carriage and turns the world into a soft, charcoal sketch. We are heading toward the red brick comfort of Kew Palace, where the air smells of damp wool, Earl Grey tea, and just a hint of medicinal lavender. This was the sanctuary, and sometimes the prison, of King George III. Now, history has been a bit loud about George. People usually remember him for two things: losing the American colonies and losing his mind. But if you look at him through the soft light of a rainy evening, he wasn't a villain. He was just a very tired, very overwhelmed man who liked clocks and farming. They called him Farmer George because he genuinely preferred talking about crop rotation and the quality of manure to discussing taxes with grumpy ministers. George was a creature of habit. He liked to get up early, eat a simple breakfast, and go for long, brisk walks. But in 1788, The royal days took a darker turn. He started talking, and talking, and talking. He once reportedly talked for 15 hours straight, until he was literally foaming at the mouth, and his voice was a ragged whisper. He wasn't being malicious. His brain had simply slipped its gears. The medical treatments of the 18th century were, to put it mildly, a nightmare. His doctors, who were mostly guessing, decided the best cure for a frantic mind was to wrap the king in blistering plasters. This involved applying caustic chemicals to his skin to raise painful blisters, under the theory that the bad humors would leak out. When that didn't work, they put him in a straitjacket and tucked him away at Kew, far from the prying eyes of London. Imagine the King of England, the man whose name was on every coin and legal document, sitting in a quiet room, shivering in a flannel dressing gown, being told he wasn't allowed to use a knife and fork because he might hurt himself. It's a very still, very lonely image. But while George was struggling with his internal weather, his children were creating their own kind of chaos. George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte, had 15 children. 15. That is a lot of royal mouths to feed, and a lot of royal egos to manage. And because George was a deeply moral, almost prudish man, he kept his daughters in a sort of golden nunnery. The princesses Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia were beautiful, educated, and incredibly bored. Their father was so protective of their virtue that he refused to let them marry. They were stuck at home, well into their 30s and 40s, living with their aging parents in a perpetual cycle of embroidery, harpsichord practice, and reading aloud. They called Kew the nunnery. They spent their days writing long, dramatic letters to each other about how much they hated their restrictive silk dresses, and how they wished they could just go for a walk without 6 footmen following them. Princess Sophia, in a fit of quiet rebellion, reportedly had a secret affair with one of her father's equerries, a man twice her age, and may or may not have had a secret baby in a cottage down the road. It's the kind of quiet, desperate drama that happens when you have too much time and not enough to do. Then there were the sons. Oh, the sons. If the daughters were repressed, the sons were expressive. The eldest, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, was the polar opposite of his father. While King George liked plain porridge and early nights, Prinny liked maraschino punch, gold leaf furniture, and staying up until 4 in the morning wearing a corset so tight he could barely breathe. He was the ultimate, sad, spoiled royal child, grown up into a very large, very expensive man. He spent so much money on his seaside palace, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which looks like a Gothic onion had a fever dream about India, that he nearly bankrupted the country. He had a collection of snuff boxes that cost more than most villages. He was famously in love with a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, whom he married in a secret, illegal ceremony, only to later marry a German princess, Caroline of Brunswick, whom he absolutely loathed. On their wedding night, the prince was so drunk he spent the entire evening passed out in the fireplace. Caroline, for her part, wasn't impressed. She reportedly remarked that he was very fat and nothing like his portrait. It wasn't exactly a fairy tale. The rest of George III's sons weren't much better. They were a collection of middle-aged dukes, living in various states of debt and scandal, fathering dozens of illegitimate children with actresses and opera singers, while the legitimate royal line grew dangerously thin. It wasn't until the race for the throne began, where all these brothers scrambled to marry sensible German princesses to produce a legal heir, that things settled down. And the winner of that race was a tiny, determined girl named Victoria, who would eventually turn the messy, scandalous House of Hanover into the prim, proper Victorian era we know today. But for now, let's leave the British Isles. Let's imagine the fog is lifting, and we're drifting across the Alps, toward the sun-drenched but equally dysfunctional palaces of Italy, and the strange, sun-baked tragedies of the Bourbons of the Two Sicilies, the Spaghetti King and the volcano's shadow. So we're leaving the damp, orderly mist of Kew and drifting south. Imagine the air is getting warmer. The persistent gray drizzle is replaced by a soft, warm evening haze that smells faintly of lemon blossoms, wood smoke, and just a touch of salty sea air. We are in Naples, the capital of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, nested in the curve of the bay, with Vesuvius smoking gently in the background. It looks idyllic, a perfect place to rest, but the court here was special. Welcome to the reign of Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, a man who truly proves that being a king doesn't mean you can't be a total disaster. Now, Ferdinand was a Bourbon. His dad was Charles III of Spain, a very efficient king, oddly enough, but Ferdinand missed that specific gene. He grew up in the sunny streets of Naples, and honestly, he much preferred the company of the Lazzaroni, the poor, vibrant common people of the city, to his own stiff, boring nobles. He called himself the King of the Lazzaroni. It sounds charming until you realize he used that connection to basically ignore all his actual responsibilities. Ferdinand was not an intellectual. He reportedly hated reading so much that his teachers eventually just gave up and let him ride horses and hunt all day. He had a great enthusiasm for killing animals. He once boasted about shooting over 600 birds in a single day. You have to wonder what his attendants thought, standing there for 12 hours while their king engaged in a one-man war on fowl. But his real passion wasn't hunting. It was practical jokes and macaroni. Yes, let's float over to one of his grand court banquets. The scene is lit by thousands of expensive beeswax candles. The table is laden with silver platters. The finest dukes and duchesses are wearing their best silks, sitting stiffly, waiting for the king to begin eating. Ferdinand arrives, but he doesn't want the fancy roasted veal. No, he wants macaroni, and not the refined version. He wants the Lazzaroni version, cooked in a huge pot right at the table. He would lean forward, grab the steaming cheese-covered noodles with his bare hands, and slide them into his mouth, tilting his head back like a performance artist. He would then look at his horrified, powdered nobles, smirk, and belch loudly. Because why be civilized when you are the absolute monarch? He was basically the 18th century equivalent of a royal frat boy. His practical jokes included ordering expensive dresses for his noble ladies, and then having his pages accidentally trip and cover them in flour. Or, even worse, he loved putting live crabs on people's plates just as they were about to eat. It's hard to imagine being that powerful and that remarkably immature. However, Ferdinand didn't rule alone. His dad, Charles III, knowing his son was a bit of a turnip, arranged a marriage for him that was supposed to fix everything. He married him to Maria Carolina of Austria. Maria Carolina was the daughter of the powerful Maria Theresa, and notably the sister of Marie Antoinette. While Ferdinand was simple and coarse, Maria Carolina was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly determined to run the country. Ferdinand's dad had given her a seat on the Privy Council the moment she produced an heir, which she did 16 times. Maria Carolina was a strategic mother. Ferdinand's reaction to his very smart wife was to basically say, "Great, you do the paperwork. I'm going to go see if I can shoot a donkey." And she did. Maria Carolina became the de facto ruler of Naples. She tried to modernize the navy, reorganize the finances, and patronize artists, all while her husband was either eating macaroni with his fingers or, quite frequently, running away. Because that's the thing about Ferdinand. When things got stressful, his first instinct was to panic and leave. In 1799, the French Revolutionary Army arrived in Naples. Maria Carolina, terrified that she would meet the same fate as her sister, this was right after Marie Antoinette had been executed. She was preparing to defend the city. Ferdinand, however, was already packed. He jumped on a British ship and sailed to Sicily, leaving his capital to the patriot revolutionaries. His return was not quiet. After the French left, Ferdinand came back and, egged on by Maria Carolina, authorized a brutal, bloody crackdown on anyone who had so much as looked at a French uniform. The streets of Naples, usually so joyful, were filled with gallows. And what about his children? With 16 kids, the Neapolitan branch of the Bourbons was huge and incredibly complicated. Their kids were just as dysfunctional as the parents, marrying other Bourbons in complicated loops of bad biology. His son, the future Francis I, was described by his own mother as idiotic and good for nothing, which seems harsh, but she knew the stock better than anyone. Ferdinand ruled, on and off, for 65 years. When he finally died in 1825, at the age of 73, Vesuvius was silent. He left behind a kingdom that was deeply, fundamentally broken, a court that was mostly famous for bad manners, and a legacy that could be summed up in one quiet, sticky, macaroni-covered word: pointless. So, let's leave Ferdinand to his perpetual pasta dinner. Let the soft Italian night close over the Bay of Naples. Imagine the gentle clinking of a carriage taking you further north, across the mountains, into the high-altitude absurdity of the Bavarian Alps. The moonlit castles of the Swan King. So, let's leave the greasy, macaroni-stained fingers of Naples behind. Imagine we're traveling north now, the air growing crisp and thin as our carriage climbs into the Bavarian Alps. The warm Mediterranean haze is replaced by a deep, velvety mountain indigo. The rain here doesn't splash, it mists, clinging to the dark pine needles and turning the jagged peaks into ghostly silhouettes. We've arrived at the doorstep of Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King. If there was ever a royal who was designed specifically for a late-night sleep story, it's Ludwig. He was the ultimate professional at avoiding reality. Ludwig was a tall, strikingly handsome young man when he took the throne in 1864. He had these deep, soulful eyes and a shock of dark hair. He looked exactly like a romantic poet's idea of a king. But Ludwig didn't actually want to be a king. Not in the signing laws and meeting ministers sense. He found the business of government to be a tedious, soul-crushing chore. He much preferred the company of Richard Wagner's operas, ancient legends, and very, very expensive architecture. As the years went by, Ludwig began to drift. He turned his back on Munich, the capital, and retreated into the mountains. He became a creature of the night, literally. He slept all day and stayed awake all night, which is a lifestyle I think many of us can relate to when we're staring at the ceiling at 3:00 a.m. He would dress up in elaborate 18th century costumes and take midnight sleigh rides through the snow, the gold leaf runners of his sleigh hissing against the ice, while his terrified servants shivered in the cold. He traveled in a carriage that was so gilded and ornate it looked like a runaway piece of the Sun King's bedroom. He didn't do this for an audience. He did it for himself. He was the only spectator in his own private theater. But Ludwig's real obsession was building. He didn't just want a house. He wanted a physical manifestation of his dreams. Let's float over to Neuschwanstein. You've probably seen it. It's the castle that inspired the Disney logo. It sits on a jagged cliff, a riot of towers and turrets. Inside, it's even weirder. There's an artificial grotto, a fake cave, built inside the palace complete, with colored lights and a mechanical swan boat. Ludwig would sit in his boat, drifting on a tiny underground lake, listening to singers perform Wagnerian arias. He was essentially the 19th century version of a guy who spends his entire life savings on a high-end gaming rig and never leaves his room. He also built Linderhof, a miniature Versailles tucked away in a valley. In the dining room, he had a wishing table, a table on a hydraulic lift that would sink through the floor into the kitchen below. The servants would load it with food and send it back up so Ludwig could eat in total solitude. He hated being looked at. He hated small talk. He just wanted his roast duck to appear out of the floor like magic. Naturally, building 3 massive, high-concept palaces while ignoring your duties tends to upset the people in charge of the budget. By 1886, Ludwig had run up a personal debt of 14 million marks. He started asking his ministers to borrow money from the Shah of Persia and the Emperor of Brazil. When they said no, he suggested they go find a hidden treasure in the mountains. The government finally decided they'd had enough of the Midnight King. They didn't depose him for being broke, though. They decided to declare him insane. They sent a team of doctors to Neuschwanstein doctors, who, mind you, had never actually met him. and diagnosed him with paranoia based on the fact that he liked to eat outdoors in the rain and talk to imaginary spirits. Ludwig's arrest was a quiet, surreal affair. He was taken to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. A few days later, he went for a walk with his psychiatrist, Dr. Gooden. Neither of them ever came back. Their bodies were found in the shallow water of the lake. The official story is that Ludwig drowned himself and the doctor tried to save him. But the water was only waist deep. Some think he was trying to escape. Some think it was a political hit. It remains one of history's most peaceful, watery mysteries. Ludwig died as he lived, in a world of shadows, leaving behind castles that would eventually make Bavaria more money in tourism than he ever spent building them. The ultimate ironic revenge of the dreamer. So, let's leave the quiet, dark waters of Lake Starnberg. The rain is still falling on our imaginary train station. The clock is still ticking. Let's drift toward our final destination, the very end of the line, where the great empires of Europe began to crumble under the weight of their own history. The quiet tea of the last Romanovs, and so we arrive at the final stop of our long, rainy journey. The tracks have led us all the way east, past the German forests and the Bavarian peaks, into the vast, snowy silence of Russia. Imagine the rain has finally turned into a soft, heavy snowfall, the kind that muffles the world and makes even a massive palace feel like a small, insulated box. We are at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, the private sanctuary of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna. If you were to walk through the halls of this palace in the early 1900s, you wouldn't feel like you were in the center of a massive, crumbling empire. You'd feel like you were in a very expensive, very cluttered Victorian parlor. Nicholas and Alexandra didn't like the grand, cold ceremonies of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They wanted to be a middle-class family that just happened to own 1/6 of the Earth's surface. Nicholas was a man of remarkably gentle temperament. He was kind, he was a devoted father, and he was, to be perfectly honest, a bit of a blank slate. He loved physical exercise. He kept meticulous diaries where he recorded the weather, how many miles he walked, and how many crows he shot in the park. On the day of a major political crisis that would eventually lead to the downfall of his dynasty, his diary entry might read, "Walked in the morning, shot 2 crows, had tea with Alex, very pleasant." He wasn't being callous, he just genuinely preferred the small, quiet details of life to the screaming demands of history. He was a man who wanted to be a country squire, but was forced to be an autocrat. Then there was Alexandra. A granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she brought the stiff, moralistic, and slightly morbid atmosphere of the British court to Russia. She was painfully shy and hated the gossipy, glittering high society of St. Petersburg. This made the Russian nobles hate her in return. They thought she was cold. She was actually just terrified of making small talk. The tragedy of the Romanovs, however, wasn't just political. It was biological, that old Habsburg ghost returning for one last haunting. Alexandra was a carrier of hemophilia, the royal disease. When her long-awaited son and heir, Alexei, was born, the family's joy turned to a quiet, constant terror. A simple bruise for Alexei could mean days of internal bleeding and agonizing pain. This secret turned the palace into a tomb. The doors were closed. The windows were muffled. The empress became obsessed with finding a cure, which led her right into the arms of Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk, with the unwashed beard and the hypnotic eyes, who claimed he could heal the boy through prayer. Imagine the scene: Ger, the Tsar of all the Russias, a man who could command millions of soldiers, sitting quietly in a small chintz-covered room, drinking tea while a Siberian peasant sat on the sofa and told the empress what to do with the government. It was an ironic, slow-motion disaster. The Romanov daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, lived in a world of big pair and little pair. They slept on camp beds, took cold baths, and were remarkably sheltered. They lived in a bubble of embroidery and private jokes, while outside the palace gates, the world was literally catching fire. When the revolution finally came in 1917, The family's reaction was almost relieved. In their exile in Siberia, they actually seemed quite happy for a while. Nicholas enjoyed chopping wood and being outdoors. The girls helped in the kitchen. For a brief moment, they got to be the simple private family they had always wanted to be. No crowns, no ministers, no crowds. Just the sound of the wind against the wooden walls of their house. Of course, we know how the story ends. The basement and the quiet, dark finale to 300 years of Romanov rule. But for our purposes tonight, let's leave them in that brief, peaceful moment in the Snow family, sitting around a table. The steam rising from a samovar. The world outside forgotten. The rain at our train station has slowed to a rhythmic drip. The last train has long since departed. The lights are dim, and the history books are closed. The kings, the queens, the half-baked potatoes, and the Swan Kings are all tucked away in the soft gray folds of the past. There's nothing left to do but drift off. No more dynasties to manage, no more cousins to marry. Just the quiet, and the rain, and the sleep.